Ready? Good. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Alexis Miller, and I'm with the Communications Branch at the Executive Council Office for the Government of Yukon. Thank you for joining us today. This is the Government of Yukon's 11th technical briefing on the heap leach failure that occurred at the Eagle Gold Mine on June 24th, 2024. Our goal remains to openly and transparently communicate with the public about the work that has been done to date by the Yukon government to protect the health and safety of Yukoners and the environment in response to the heap leach failure at Victoria Gold's mine. Should you have questions that cannot be addressed by these subject matter experts, or if we do not have time to answer all your questions today, feel free to reach out to Jordan Owens with Cabinet Communications at jordan.owens@yukon.ca, and she will be happy to direct your question to the appropriate department. I understand this briefing is being live streamed by news outlets, and I'd like to welcome members of the public who are joining us as well. The Yukon government will post the recording of this briefing on Facebook later today. We are also regularly updating the yukon.ca Victoria Gold online hub, which you can find at yukon.ca/Victoria-gold-updates. I would now like to introduce the technical experts here today. There will be some introductory comments before opening the floor to questions. From the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources, we are joined by Aaron Dowd, the Manager of Major Mine Licensing. From the Department of Environment, we are joined by Tyler Williams, a water resources scientist. We will start with Aaron Dowd for some opening remarks.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Aaron Dowd. I am the Director of Technical Services on the Eagle Gold Response with the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources. I'm here today to give you an update on site developments. So we just put a visual up over on the side there, and we'll start just regarding the water discharge that was announced last week. Last week, the court-appointed receiver for Victoria Gold Corp began to discharge treated water from the mine site. This action is the safest option to ensure water levels on site remain at manageable levels during spring melt. A large volume of water will require management during the spring melt, along with the waters currently stored in the heap leach facility and storage ponds. A significant amount of this water will require treatment prior to being discharged to the environment. There's a limit to how much water can be treated on a daily basis. And technical advisors working for the receiver have advised that it's necessary to begin the process of discharging water now to ensure there's enough storage space during the spring melt. This is critical to avoid the uncontrolled discharge of treated water containing cyanide. If we move to the next slide. So the water treatment process is complicated. We have a slide up on the side here that shows the process in general. So the first step includes removing metals from the water. It then moves to a reverse osmosis process that removes fine particulates and further reduces the metals. At that point, the copper is added to the process and it moves to a pond. And in that pond is where the cyanide removal to the license limits occurs. That results in water that has high copper. And so then there's more chemicals that are added that would remove the copper particulates. And that goes to the settling pond. In that pond is where copper settles out, it's removed. It goes to a final control point where it's then discharged to the environment. So the part of the treatment process that adds copper to reduce the cyanide levels, it results in elevated copper, and work right now is underway to commission that final settling pond. So this work is in process and in the coming weeks will be completed. At this point, the water that is being discharged from site has elevated copper in it. So the site conditions at site do not allow for the receiver to wait for this final step to be completed prior to discharge. So as mentioned, a release is now required to avoid the uncontrolled release of untreated water. The receiver has kept the government of Yukon and the First Nation of Notchanack informed of the site conditions and discharge regarding water discharge. Technical advisors to each government have acknowledged that this is the best course of action to prepare for spring melt. Currently, the water being discharged is compliant with cyanide requirements under the amended water license, which was issued to the receiver by the Yukon Water Board in December. Discharged water, as I said, has elevated levels of copper and is not fully compliant with the water license or the federal regulations. However, based on dilution and other factors, it is anticipated to pose low risk to aquatic life by the time it enters Haggart Creek. So water is not being discharged directly to Haggart Creek. It is instead being discharged in locations that will allow for additional dilution and settling before it arrives to Haggart Creek. And daily water samples will be collected and are being collected, and a comprehensive environmental monitoring program is underway. Can we move to the next slide? So this just shows an overlay of the site and where all the different features are. So with respect to the pond leak, we believe that a storage pond is leaking at the Eagle Gold Mine, and the receiver is proceeding under the assumption that there is a leak and is taking the necessary actions to reduce the risks. Investigations are underway in the surrounding area and will be undertaken in the pond when it is fully drained and free of ice. The receiver has begun constructing an interception system in the area to collect groundwater should it be determined to be impacted. The receiver has increased environmental monitoring in the area, including sampling the pond for water quality and toxicity, monitoring the adjacent groundwater wells, and surface water monitoring in Haggart Creek. So work is continuing to advance at site, and the preparation for the spring melt being the key priority. In the coming weeks, the receiver will be advancing work on new water storage ponds, improving water conveyance structures, and conducting investigations on the heap leach facility. The government of Yukon will continue to provide information on the receiver's activities on site and on our website via technical briefings when significant events occur or milestones are achieved. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. I'll now pass it on to Tyler Williams for some remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm here to speak to results from water quality monitoring in the downstream environment. The Department of Environment continues to assess water quality data in the environment downstream of the mine site. Since being notified in early January of a leak from a newly built containment pond on the mine site, we have been reviewing water quality data from Haggart Creek to assess whether the suspected leak water could be entering the creek. The most recent results indicate that the contaminated water that leaked from the containment pond is now impacting the creek. This includes seeing higher levels of contaminants such as cyanide, cobalt, chloride, and nickel downstream of the leak in Haggart Creek. In particular, the data is showing cyanide levels above the BC acute short-term aquatic life guideline since mid-January. The data is showing us a cumulative effect from the containment pond leak and the ongoing contamination that continues to enter Haggart Creek from the heap leach failure. In cases where contaminants exceeded their aquatic life guidelines, there could be negative effects to the health of fish and other organisms. This is why the ongoing monitoring of water quality, aquatic life, and fish health downstream of the mine site remains important. As discharge happens on site, water quality monitoring in Haggart Creek will continue. It takes time for samples to be collected, shipped to labs, analyzed, and for that data to be provided to us. As we have over the course of this response, we will continue to provide updates and report water quality data on yukon.ca as it is available. Thank you.
Thank you for your updates. I will now open the floor to questions. In the interest of fairness, we will begin by giving each reporter one question and one follow-up. If possible, please keep your question concise and identify to whom your question is directed. We will begin with reporters in the room and then turn to reporters joining remotely. Folks joining online, please indicate in the chat if you have a question you'd like to ask, and please identify your name and media outlet. We'll begin with Sarah, Radio-Canada.
Thank you. My question is for Taylor Williams, I think. The thing is, I'm really confused about when we are talking about the risk and the toxicity of the water, especially because, well, you said that water quality data show an increase of contaminant in the Haggard Creek, yet we have the PwC, the receiver last report that is saying that the water that is being discharged is like not compliant but not posing any threat. If we are to add that water that is still not compliant to the toxicity of the water we have right now, isn't it just creating something that is even more toxic?
Right. So it's important to differentiate between those two different sources, right? You have the leak pond scenario, which had cyanide concentrations, right, in the neighborhood of 30 milligrams per liter, which that is what we are seeing enter Haggard Creek downstream of that leak. The water that's being discharged has been successfully treated for cyanide. It does have the copper, but there is no copper showing up in the creek from any of the existing sources right now, right? So the copper results we've been seeing throughout the winter, including this recent data downstream of the leak, is indicating very low or non-detect copper levels in the creek that are representative of background conditions. So two very, very different sources there. And for the copper, you're not adding on to an existing source. It's, if copper makes it to the creek, and there's not any reason to believe that it will show up significantly in the creek, but if it does, it's not adding on to an existing copper source.
Follow-up question?
I think my follow-up is also for you, because I'm also wondering, like, how dangerous is copper? We now know what are the effects of cyanide, but what are the effects for the copper if it was to ever reach the creek?
Yeah, so copper is toxic. It can be acutely or chronically toxic to aquatic life. There are guidelines for both. Dissolved copper is the primary concern from a toxicity perspective. In this case, the water that is being discharged has high total copper, but not high dissolved copper. So that's an important consideration for, and the most recent aquatic life guidelines that have been developed are for dissolved copper.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Julian, CBC.
Hey, is this thing on? Yeah. So I'm just looking for some more information about the leak. So maybe Aaron, you're the best person to ask. So you mentioned that there are some actions that the receiver is taking, collecting groundwater or intercepting it. But in terms of a timeline for, really getting into that pond and fixing it, do you have a timeline?
No, there's not a specific timeline for accessing the pond itself. So the interception work is happening right now. Wells are being drilled. And what will have to happen is the pond will have to be drained and the ice will have to be removed. So we don't have an exact timeline for that yet.
Yeah, I wonder, is this something that we're going to have to wait until the spring to do? And what would be the problem there if we're in the middle of spring melt and the leak still isn't fixed?
No, I don't anticipate it would be something for the spring. There's a strong incentive to fix that pond. It provides additional 90,000 cubic meters of storage on site, so it will be a priority action.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Jim, Yukon News.
Yes, thank you. Firstly, I'm wondering whether Waters Act charges are on the table for the non-compliance with the license that we've seen here.
I can't speak on behalf of any of the enforcement measures.
Okay, then secondly, I'm going to ask about progress with the settling pond. Do you have an ETA on completion on that?
The anticipated completion would be the end of this month.
And like it seems to be an important step in the water treatment scheme as it's drawn up now, why hasn't this kind of measure been included in past attempts to treat the water?
It's based on the testing that has occurred to date that has shown that that additional step would be required. It wasn't previously planned for. So that's why it's being done now.
Thank you. That's all for the reporters in the room. So we'll move to the folks online. I have Ashley from the Canadian Press.
Hi, folks. I hope you can hear me all right. It's always a bit of hit and miss with Zoom. I am trying to get a better understanding of the leak in the pond as well. I don't know whether it's an Aaron question or a Tyler question. The pond has been leaking since December. Do you have a sense of how much cyanide has leaked into, you've talked about cumulative effect, but do you have a sense of how much cyanide and other contaminants have leaked into Haggard Creek from the pond itself since the leak was discovered in December?
Yeah, I can take that. So yeah, we do know we know how much water was transferred into that pond to start with, and observing the water level changes in that pond over time, can understand how much has leaked out of that pond. So of the cyanide contaminated water that was transferred into that pond, roughly 19,000 cubic meters is believed to have leaked out of that pond. There is additional transfer of water into that pond that was then this treated water that was elevated in copper, but it was not, it was treated for cyanide. So the total volume of leaked water would be higher, but the primary concern is with cyanide. So about 19,000 cubic meters of cyanide water.
Okay, so I just need to make sure I have my head wrapped around that. So 19,000 cubic meters of cyanide contaminated water, but you continued using the pond even though it was leaking, just not for cyanide water anymore? Is that correct? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, so based on the advice of the receiver's technical experts, they determined that sending treated water from the water treatment plant would be beneficial to send it to the pond and provide a dilution factor for this stored water that was already there. And so the water was transferred and that transfer stopped mid-January.
Okay, so just to be clear, there is still water in the pond, but you're not adding any more. And the maximum capacity for the storage is 3,000 cubic meters? Did I hear that right?
No, the maximum capacity of that pond is approximately 90,000 cubic meters. And so there is still water stored in that pond in the form of some water and as well as ice. But no additional transfers are occurring.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Next, we have Nathan from CKRW.
Hey, this is Nathan from CKRW. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Perfect, thank you. This is a question for Aaron. I'm curious if the Yukon government was informed ahead of the last week's discharge. Were you informed ahead of time of the plans to discharge or after the fact?
Yukon government has been involved in the discussions with the receiver about discharge options. So we were informed of the various options ahead of time, yes.
Were you aware that this was the option they were going to proceed with ahead of time?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Noting time, we have time for one more round of questions. So I'll go through the list again. We'll start with Sarah, Radio-Canada. Putting you on the spot. Yeah, we can go to Julian.
It's okay. Have you found any more dead fish in Haggard Creek?
No.
I don't have any other questions.
Yeah, thanks. Just returning to the storage pond there. What sort of quality assurance did the territorial government perform as that pond was being constructed?
So the pond was constructed by the receiver and their team. The quality assurance was done done by a third party to the pond construction team. So Yukon government was not involved in the quality assurance process.
Given that we've had a leak here, and there are further ponds being constructed, will there be any additional steps that the government is requesting to ensure that this doesn't happen again?
Yeah, so the receiver will put in additional assurances. They have a different quality assurance team that will be working on site. So we'll be closely following that and ensuring additional checks and balances are in place.
Sarah, are you ready for your question? Okay.
Thank you. Just wondering, do we have any information about downstream the Haggard Creek? We talked about the toxicity that we can find in the Haggard Creek, but what about the rest? Do we have information?
The water quality just in general downstream in the creek? Yeah, so we are exceeding water quality objectives for nitrite, WAD cyanide, cobalt. And so cobalt is exceeding throughout the length of Haggard Creek. All this data is reported in the tables that are on the website. Cyanide is exceeding acute toxicity thresholds to about station W99, which is 3 kilometers or so downstream of Devlin Gulch. Nitrite is exceeding chronic water quality objectives to the W99 location as well.
We'll go back online. So we have Ashley, Canadian Press. Do you have another question?
Yes, I do. I'm hoping Tyler or either of you, I suppose, can, when you say that the various contaminants, the cyanide, cobalt, et cetera, are exceeding levels, can you put that in plain language for someone who isn't super involved in the science? Is it 25% higher than it should be, 3 times higher than it should be? Like, what do you mean by exceeding objectives?
Yeah, so in this case, those contaminants I just measured, the water quality objectives are equivalent to aquatic life guidelines. And these guidelines are broad, they're developed provincially or nationally, and they're meant to protect aquatic life in all stages of life, all species. So they're meant to be conservative thresholds, right? So being above them doesn't necessarily mean there is an effect to aquatic life happening. It means there is now a risk that there could be effects to aquatic life. So I think that's, ultimately the guidelines are a tool. They're something useful to reference, but the ultimate answer to these questions of what is impact to aquatic life will come from the monitoring of fish and aquatic lives that will be ongoing and continuing long-term, into next year and beyond. So, yeah.
Right, but could you put some sort of could you quantify it in some way? I appreciate that it's just flagging a risk and you're not guaranteeing that every fish is going to drop dead. But is it 10% higher than what the threshold should be? Twice as much what the threshold should be? Like, can you quantify it in some way for me, please?
Right, so the values that we're monitoring, the numbers, how high are they above the guideline, I think is what you're asking there.
Yes, please.
Yeah, if you look at the data that's online, so for WAD cyanide, for instance, the highest concentration there is around 0.02 milligrams per liter, which would be twice the acute guideline. So that's the highest of what we've seen for that parameter. I'm not going to go through the math on each one. I don't have them all in my head here, but you can compare the cobalt numbers there to the guideline as well and come up with those numbers.
Thank you. We'll now go to CKRW. Nathan, do you have another question?
No follow-ups from me, thank you.
Okay, that is all for today. Please feel free to reach out with any additional questions and we'll do our best to address those in a timely fashion. I would like to remind everyone that more information on the government's efforts to address the Eagle Gold heap leach failure can be found at yukon.ca Victoria-gold-updates. This website is updated throughout the week as more information becomes available. Thank you to our technical experts for coming today and to everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful day.